Do you know that after recording Strawberry Fields Forever, John Lennon spliced together two completely different takes in different keys and tempos because he couldn't decide what was perfect? Or maybe you've heard the story of Steve Jobs, who once demanded that the circuit boards inside the original Macintosh be redone simply because they weren't aesthetically pleasing enough, despite the fact that no customer would ever see them. Now, the pursuit of perfection can drive extraordinary achievement, but at what cost? Perhaps you recognise some of these patterns in your own life. Do you spend hours refining emails that others would just send in minutes? Maybe you've abandoned creative projects because they weren't meeting your impossibly high standards. Do you find yourself exhausted by the relentless inner critic that's never satisfied with good enough? Or maybe you work with a perfectionist who creates brilliant work but misses deadlines because they're endlessly revising. Or maybe you live with someone whose need for control creates tension in your relationship. Perfectionism isn't really about being perfect. It's about being unable to tolerate being imperfect. And while we often celebrate it as a virtue, like a badge of honour, research shows it's strongly linked to anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and burnout. Today we'll journey through the psychology of perfectionism, explore fascinating case studies including the Beatles' creative collapse and Trent Reznor's artistic struggles, and uncover practical strategies to break free from impossible standards without sacrificing excellence. Whether you're a perfectionist yourself or dealing with one in your own life, this episode will transform how you understand the pursuit of excellence. So let's dive deep into the perfectionism trap and discover how to escape. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. In my preparation for the episode I did on burnout, I was actually genuinely surprised to learn that the personality trait of perfectionism was a contributing factor. In fact, I was actually really surprised when I read that and I learned of that. Indeed, I was left wondering if I had perfectionistic personality traits myself, as I have suffered from burnout on and off for years now, and it has been quite debilitating for me at times. I certainly raised a lot of thought-provoking questions about perfectionism in that episode on burnout. And I actually want to quickly recap the crux of my questions I posed, because I think it sets up this episode very nicely. So in that episode on burnout, I noticed what I called the paradox of perfectionism. All those things that have made you successful, like diligence, dutifulness, conscientiousness, perseverance, and being achievement-focused, these are generally the same traits that contribute to burnout. As such, I was left wondering, how does perfectionism contribute to burnout? I mean, I think that is a logical question to ask. The other question, is there such a thing as healthy perfectionism? And the last question that I posed in that episode was, when does perfectionism turn from healthy perfectionism, that is useful and positive for every person in their life? And of course, we all need high standards and we all need goals, and they are very helpful things. But when does it turn from healthy perfectionism to unhealthy or unhelpful perfectionism? That's overwhelmingly negative and significantly disrupts a person's life, actually to the point they can't function anymore. So I did pose these questions at the time, and at the time I honestly didn't have an answer. And hence why it led to this episode on perfectionism. And I want to share some of my findings. Welcome to Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz, where academic rigour meets real life. I'm Dr. Stephen Stolz, educator, philosopher and academic at the University of Adelaide. And this podcast series is my quest to help everyday people access research-based ideas that feed curiosity and foster deep thinking. In today's episode, we explore perfectionism, a trait that you think would deliver results, however, if left unchecked, can lead to serious problems that are overwhelmingly negative. Perfectionism can be likened to a prison, where the fear of failure drives a destructive cycle that is difficult to break. In this episode, I will challenge everything you thought you knew about perfectionism and also reveal some approaches and techniques to overcome perfectionism. So join me as we bridge the gap between evidence-based research and everyday application. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. I want to start with a few brief stories. Let's start with Turbo from the pub. I'm not too sure Turbo realises it, but he seems obsessed with cleanliness. Now, Sludge, who is his mate at the pub, they get along great together, and that's very obvious. He's always going on about how clean his truck is and that it needs to be spotless before he leaves the yard for work in the morning, both inside and out. And to do this, Turbo arrives early for work each day. You don't need to know anything about trucking to know that trucks get worked hard, and they are in all sorts of extreme conditions. On work sites, dirt, mud, rain, you name it. They get treated like a workhorse, and that's what trucks really are. Now, according to Sludge, when Turbo's truck gets dirty or something gets in his truck or someone gets into his truck, if you like, with dirty or muddy boots, he loses his shit, like he loses his cool, like you'd never believe. Now, Sludge thinks this is hilarious. And, of course, I don't think he fully appreciates what's going on here, and I think Sludge gives him a hard time about it. But it's quite clear what is going on here with Turbo around the need for control and order. And, of course, the absurdity of this scenario is very, very clear when you relate trucks and how hard they work with Turbo, who seems obsessed with cleanliness. Now to the story about producer Luke and myself. Now, I've known producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, for years. I'm talking over 25 years now. And I knew he had high standards. And this was confirmed when he has asked me to redo or re-record episodes or parts of episodes for this podcast because they were not up to standard. Now, to be honest, this made me actually quite nervous because I too have a tendency to strive for perfection in everything I do. So this nervousness was understandable, particularly when it comes to this podcast. Now, thankfully, we both had the wisdom to have a conversation before we started this podcast around acceptable standards, which we both agreed to. And this was balanced against the realities that we both work full-time, and this podcast is a shared passion project that we do in our own free time. In fact, we fit it in around our busy schedules where possible. Now, I would hate to think of what would happen if we didn't have this conversation before we embarked on this podcast together. Now, when it comes to perfectionism, particularly the negative problems it can generate, I immediately think of the story of Andy. Now, in academia, I see perfectionism everywhere. Now, it's everywhere. It's part of our job almost to a point where it's really problematic. In fact, I would argue it's expected in many of the things we expected to do and a lot of the tasks and activities that are part of what academics do. Now, without a doubt, academia is a challenging vocation. That's, of course, if you view it as a vocation, and not many people do. You could look at it as a job, I guess. But however you want to view academia, it has a lot of pressure, and there are long hours working on your own, and there are a lot of competing demands, and there are a lot of competition, not only between my colleagues and I, but with colleagues in general, from other universities. And that competition ranges from, grant funding, we're all, kind of trying to get a piece of the pie, all the way through to promotions and a whole range of other things where we're in competition. Now, many academics I know are perfectionists. Some are even quite open about it. It's like a badge of honour, really. However, there's a sinister side to perfectionism that is dangerous. Now, it's safe to say that Andy was obsessed with his academic career and was keen to climb what I call the slippery pole of academia in order to become a full professor. That's the highest ranking at a university, at least where I'm from. So he worked 12 to 14-hour days, 7 days a week, holidays, even Christmas Day, in order to climb the slippery pole. Now, up to a point, this led to some success and some promotion. However, when he was unsuccessful with his promotion application to professor, this perceived failure came at a heavy cost, with a nervous breakdown and an extended period of sick leave. But I remember bumping into him one day at a cafe. I inquired how he's getting on, and I remember the conversation we had. One thing that I remember Andy telling me, and it stuck with me ever since, is the way in which his breakdown stemmed from a general sense that his identity was mainly concerned with his work, and when combined with unrealistic and rigid expectations, led to eventual burnout. It's actually quite a sad story, but a true story. Since this conversation a few years ago with Andy, I'm reminded by a conversation I had with a psychologist called Greg, and a big shout out to Greg if you're listening today, who told me about how perfectionism is like a self-imposed prison. Now, this didn't really make sense to me at the time when he said it, but it certainly does now. And let me try and explain. If your self-worth and your identity is dependent on striving and achievement, then it's easy to get trapped in a cycle of overwork, particularly if you fail to meet your unrealistic standards. This self-imposed trap will lead to burnout and a range of awful health and well-being outcomes that are all negative. Now, to me, this made sense, and this is why I mention it now in this episode. I also found it quite useful to consider some famous depictions of perfectionism that most people would know. Immediately, I thought of Steve Jobs, who was known for his demanding standards and relentless pursuit of perfection in his products and designs at Apple. In fact, depending on which movie you look at, he's depicted as a bit of a tyrant. However, I think there was a bit of a sweet moment with Steve Jobs. I think there was a lot of people who respected what he could do, but at the same time, I think it came at a cost. So hence the bittersweet. Then there is Stanley Kubrick. Some of you might not know Stanley Kubrick, but think of Space Odyssey 2001. That movie is sensational, one of my favourite films. And I would say he's probably one of my favourite directors. But he was famous for taking years to make a film due to his meticulous attention to detail and just his willingness to repeat scenes over and over again. And a well-known example is a famous example, actually, in The Shining, where he was reported to do 148 takes just to get one scene right. That's 148 takes. Wow, that's a lot. And I'll leave with one other example worth noting, and this is more a Hollywood depiction. And I do think it's reasonably accurate, actually. But although it's quite extreme, I immediately think of Monica from Friends, who's played by Courtney Cox. And then there is Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, who's played by Jim Parsons. Now, in relation to that latter one about Sheldon, well, even though Sheldon is portrayed with a range of characteristics, potentially autism and a few others, and obsessive-compulsive type disorders, I think it's worth noting some of the perfectionistic traits on display around the need for control, and that's manifested in rigid and inflexible ways of doing. And I think Sheldon in the TV show portrays that very well. It's actually quite obvious. And I think Parson does a fantastic job in his characterization of Sheldon. Now, you're probably wondering, what is perfectionism? Okay, so in preparation for this episode, I discovered there is a lot of literature. In fact, there is a huge body of literature. And you only need to do a quick search and you'll see that there are thousands, actually, of books and articles, and they can fall into a couple of categories. Obviously, the self-help category is quite a large category, which has been popular today. And, of course, you have the usual handbooks for healthcare professionals. But look, what this demonstrates is that perfectionism actually is a significant issue in society. The fact that there are so many pieces of literature, like books, articles, ranging from self-help through to handbooks for clinical psychologists, says this is a major issue in society. Now, I know early on I did question the notion of healthy perfectionism, and I actually found it quite useful to view healthy perfectionism type traits at one end of the continuum that could be deemed positive. Say there are certain professions or jobs at one end that you would want someone to be conscientious and achievement-orientated and so on, and I mentioned that earlier. And, of course, I would want surgeons and medicos to possess all of those traits, particularly if they're going to do surgery on me. Now, of course, at the other end of the continuum, there's maladaptation or negative personality traits that could be viewed as problematic. Now, some of these are like fear of failure. Some of these are well-known, like procrastination. Some of the other ones are around no or low tolerance for ambiguity, so think of just black and white thinking. And some of the other ones are like catastrophizing, believing that there is an issue or problem when there actually isn't one. Now, Inevitably, the logical question to ask here revolves around what causes someone to move from positive forms of perfectionism to negative forms of perfectionism. In fact, I wanted that myself. Hence why I asked that question at the start of this episode. Now, even though the idea of striving for perfectionism or high standards might seem logical on some level, and that to me it makes sense on a human and intuitive level. However, sometimes if you have unrealistic standards, well then of course that's just simply unattainable. And I guess it's a question of what those standards are and how realistically they are. So this is where I don't have a problem with setting high standards or goals, but they have to be achievable. They have to be realistic. So when it comes to perfectionism, here is the problem. Perfectionism seems to be one of the few socially accepted vices openly promoted in contemporary society, and yet we already know it leads to burnout and a range of other problems. In fact, some people are openly boasting about their levels of perfectionism, and I'm actually not sure that that's a healthy thing to do. So what is perfectionism, and how is it different from a healthy desire to achieve high standards? Well, generally speaking, when it comes to perfectionism, I just want you to think of it like this. I want you to think it's like a constant striving to meet very high standards that are self-imposed, and they are just relentlessly pursued despite these causing problems. It also involves a component of your self-worth or identity almost exclusively connected to how well you achieve these high standards or pursued and achieved. Now, people with perfectionism often feel they are unable to meet their high standards, generally because they're unrealistic. And so you can start seeing how this becomes problematic in terms of avoidance, and because there's a fear of failure that leads to a form of paralysis, right? And at the same time, self-worth identity seems to be based on this striving, in terms of attaining these goals. And of course, if you can't attain them, that's really problematic. And of course, if you do achieve any goals, well, generally this pleasure is just short-lasting and it's just fleeting. So if your self-worth is based on achievement and you both pursue your goals relentlessly and dismiss any achievement, then it's a no-win situation because you're likely to feel failure whether you achieve your goals or not. And this is the fear of failure that's the driver of perfectionism. And so the important parts of perfectionism are three kind of parts. One is demanding standards and self-criticism. So those demanding standards are just completely unrealistic standards. They're just almost unachievable, but yet perfectionists still set them. The other one is striving to meet demanding standards despite the negative effects it's having on the person's behaviour, their life, and so on and so forth. And the last one is just based on self-evaluation on achieving high standards. This is that self-criticism. And so that fear of failure is part of that self-criticism that happens when a person doesn't achieve their unrealistically and rigid high standards. Now, recently, psychologists have begun to see perfectionism as a multidimensional concept, and it consists of three parts. There's the self-orientated perfectionism, and that's other-orientated perfectionism is the second one. And then there are socially prescribed perfectionism. Self-orientated perfectionism is a tendency to have high standards for yourself that are just completely unrealistic. They're just impossible to attain. Other-orientated perfectionism is a tendency to demand that others meet your unrealistically high standards, so you are basically displacing your high standards on others. Think of it like a parent displacing their high standards on their children. So that's other-orientated perfectionism. And then we got socially prescribed perfectionists. And that's those individuals that believe that to gain approval from others, these high standards must be met. Now, unlike self-orientated perfectionism, in which expectations are self-imposed, in socially prescribed perfectionism, the high standards are believed to be imposed by others. And that is very similar to other-orientated perfectionism. However, this one is a socially orientated one in terms of, think of groups. Think of a social group, and I automatically think of social groups at schools and so on and so forth. Now, by now you're wondering, what's the difference between healthy pursuit of excellence and unhelpful perfectionism? This is a logical question to ask. Indeed, most people have strong opinions about how they should perform and how certain things should be done. And in fact, there are a lot of people who have very, very strong beliefs about that very thing. Although some standards are helpful, and I talked about that, it's important to have high standards, right? There's no one saying you can't, and there's no one saying you can't have goals, but they have to be realistic. Unfortunately, people are often not very good at assessing the accuracy of their own beliefs about their standards, and I think this is part of the problem. And so most of us just assume that their beliefs are correct or their high standards are achievable, even though they're probably not. The appropriateness of the belief about standards for performance depends on a couple of different factors, and I'll just go through these quickly. The excessiveness of the standard. For example, can this goal be met? Inevitably, if it can't, then it's just too excessive or just unrealistic. The accuracy of the belief. For instance, is it true that this standard must be met? So if it's inaccurate, as in, I must achieve it, well, then, of course, that's really problematic. Next one is a cost-benefit type analysis. For example, does it help me to have this belief or standard? Like if it's a no or it's having a negative impact on my life, then I do believe it's actually worth reassessing that actual belief or standard. And the next one is flexibility of the standard or belief. And think of it like this. Are you able to adjust my standard, or can you adjust your standard and change my beliefs when necessary? Now, if your belief is so inflexible and rigid, that generally is a sign that you have some form of perfectionism. That could be potentially problematic in some part of your life somewhere. Now, the main point I just want to stress here is that the more inflexible your beliefs are and the more situations in which you have inflexible opinions, then it's likely to increase your chances of problems arising. Now, this is particularly true in situations where your beliefs are arbitrary and subjective rather than based on facts or hard evidence. And for example, take this common example. It's around drinking. Now, we already know the effects of alcohol on driving. And we already know that the more you consume, the more likelihood it will impair your driving and the likelihood it could potentially lead to an accident. And of course, that is based on fact and hard evidence. In fact, there's a lot of science around the more drinks you consume, the more impaired you become. Whereas an inflexible belief is around something along the lines in a social scenario that all people should listen to jazz music and that other types of music are just simply inferior. Now, that can cause problems, right? Particularly if you have friends who don't like jazz music. It really, so you can see how that could potentially create problems. Now, I realise that's an arbitrary example, but these are not necessarily arbitrary type scenarios. They do impact on a person's life over time, and it's not generally just one thing. It's an accumulative thing, a number of things. And so for many people, it's extremely difficult to know where a healthy pursuit of excellence ends and unhelpful perfectionism begins. Now, it is possible for the two to coexist. I'm not denying that. However, where it becomes problematic is where you can't pursue something in a healthy way. While in another area of your life, striving for achievement is causing you problems and becoming unhelpful, then I would say, well, okay, that's where that maladaptation is taking place and having a negative impact on your life. Now, one reason why many people find perfectionism difficult to change is that it's actually been helpful in their lives to get them where they are up to a point. And so you can see how over time this would be problematic. So if I've had some perfectionistic traits and it's helped me to get promoted and also get a job and achieve all sorts of things, well, you can see how this automatically becomes problematic in terms of how we understand these traits and how this becomes a very, very complex scenario because it's actually hard for us to see our unhelpful perfectionism. Now, and I always reminded that it's generally those who are closest to us, whether it's our partner, our girlfriend, boyfriend, our best mates, our best friends. Think of Sludge and Turbo. I'm sure Sludge can see the perfectionism of Turbo, but I think my point is that it's one thing to identify and see it, but then it's another thing for the individual with the perfectionistic traits to be able to acknowledge it and identify it. And then, of course, willing to do something about it. Change is tough. Change is very difficult. And so it's one thing to say, oh, well, I have perfectionistic traits, but then it's another thing to say, look, I actually think it's having a negative impact on my life and I actually want to make changes. They are two very different things. the main differences between a healthy pursuit of excellence, and I'm all for that, and unhelpful perfectionism are these things. Now, in unhelpful perfectionism, if the person's views of themselves is just way too dependent on how well they think they achieve their own demeaning standards, then I think this is a recipe for disaster. And the other one is, in unhelpful perfectionism, people continue to pursue their standards despite negative consequences. So if you continue to pursue unattainable, high standards and you know that they're just never going to be obtainable and it's creating all sorts of problems in a person's life and you continue to do so, then I would say you're definitely tipping over into unhelpful and negative forms of perfectionism. And just think of Andy, who worked pretty much 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, even during Christmas Day, in order to kind of achieve his unrealistic goals. So when does perfectionism cause problems? Well, perfectionism is associated with a range of problems that are overwhelmingly negative. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Generally, it's associated with anxiety, because you have general feelings of anxiety around performance. It's quite common. And then we've got other problems that are also around obsessive type traits, or commonly referred to as obsessive compulsive disorders or obsessive compulsive personality disorders. There are a whole range of different obsessive type traits here going on. Other things that are associated with perfectionism is depression, because perfectionists often think they are failing to meet their own high and unrealistic standards. So you can imagine all that striving would make you tired, of course, but all that constant striving and that failure to meet your unrealistic standards, I can understand over time would lead to some forms of a depressive mood or depressive state. I definitely can see how that would happen. Other associated problems are, or if you like, it's a well-known contributing factor that can cause someone to be at risk of eating difficulties. And of course, the other one is, and I mentioned it very briefly at the start of the episode, is that there are a range of unhelpful types of behaviours like avoidance, procrastination, performance checking, catastrophizing, and other counterproductive behaviours. In relation to the question of cause, and that's a complex question, the influence of both nature, and that's genetic inheritance, and nurture, that's environment, would appear to be contributing factors. However, the research suggests that our environment plays an important role, and it's looking like nurture has a quite significant role to play here when it comes to perfectionism. In fact, the research demonstrates that perfectionism is a complex human behaviour, and by now you've probably realised that. And there are a whole range or multiple causes of perfectionism and not just one single cause. And what this means basically is that there are a range of different approaches that can be effective in decreasing the harmful impact of perfectionism. And so the logical question that I go to next is, why does perfectionism persist and why are perfectionists so resistant to change? As I mentioned before, it's one thing to identify you have perfectionistic traits, and then it's another thing to actually want to do something about it. They're actually very different things. So for me, this was a logical question to ask. And I found that the cognitive behavioural model of perfectionism developed by Safran and colleagues in the book titled Overcoming Perfectionism to be useful in understanding the reasons why perfectionists are so resistant to change. And in fact, I'll ask producer Luke to provide those details in the episode descriptor. Now, what's clear from this model is the way in which perfectionists are locked in a cycle that is difficult to break. This is, if you like, the self-imposed prison that I talked about at the start of this episode. And I just want you to think of this diagram. At the very, very top of the diagram is self-worth. That's connected to striving and achievement. And then it goes down to inflexible, rigid standards. Think just unbelievably rigid standards. And then you have 3 trees that break off. And the first tree is around performance-related behaviours. So that's just constant striving to meet standards. And they are just generally counterproductive. And you can see how that then loops back to self-worth and identity in terms of constant striving. The second tree that goes down is just failing to meet standards. They are similar because generally if they are unrealistic standards, they're never going to be met no matter what you do. So you can see how that traps you in this cycle where your self-worth and identity, it's just depended on just this constant striving and achievement. In fact, as I talk about it, I'm just exhausted talking about it. It's just this constant cycle, right, where you're trapped. And then the third branch or third tree down in the diagram just relates to cognitive biases. Now, individuals can have success and they can temporarily meet these standards. In fact, it does happen from time to time. In fact, that's part of the reason why perfectionists continue this cycle, because sometimes through their own striving, they continue to achieve some success. That makes sense, right? However, the problem is that when they gain success or have some form of achievement, they don't celebrate the achievement. Or if they do, they explain it away as, oh, I just got lucky, or they just continue to reevaluate their success and give reasons for why they actually achieved their success instead of just acknowledging it, that it was through their hard work and what they did through their achievements. And so you can see how this becomes problematic. The perfectionist never stops. It never celebrates. It never gives any value and worth to what they've achieved. And all they do is, if anything, if they do achieve it at all, and it's very unlikely that they do, they'll reevaluate and go, oh, I just got lucky. Because I got lucky, I just need to change my high standards again, because I just got lucky and I just need to do something about it. And so this kind of cognitive biases just leads to constant reappraisal of these standards. And they're just insufficiently demanding. You're just constantly reassessing them, not celebrating achievements for what they are. And if you do, they're just fleeting. They're just short-lived. And so you can see how this model essentially demonstrates and reinforces this perfectionism. It's just this constant loop back to self-worth and identity connected to striving and achievement. Oh, okay, I couldn't achieve it. And so I need to double down. I just need to work harder. And so you can see how there's this kind of this self-imposed prison that's almost impossible to get out of. So what are some of the strategies for overcoming perfectionism? How can I get out of my self-imposed jail of perfectionism? The good news, if you want to call it good news, is that the treatment that has had the most success at tackling perfectionism is called cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. And of course, this is the main approach adopted by most psychologists in terms of tackling perfectionism. Now, I do realise it's difficult to change. I am the first person to acknowledge that. But I think it's the starting point really is, first of all, to identify what's keeping the perfectionism going. Okay, so yes, I might acknowledge I might have certain perfectionistic traits. Yeah, I think we all do at some point, particularly if you're a high-achieving white-collar professional or you're just a high-achieving individual. However, I think there is an important thing here in terms of self-evaluating whether that's been healthy or unhealthy forms of perfectionism, as I mentioned earlier. I've got some questions here for you to reflect on. So the first question is how you think about yourself, feel about yourself, or judge yourself dependent on achieving or striving. Now, would you feel bad about yourself as a person if you did not achieve or strive to achieve high standards? Now, if you said yes, you felt bad about not being able to achieve something you've set out to achieve, then I would say this is part of the problem, and this would be a contributing factor for why your perfectionism continues to keep going. Now, the next question to ask yourself is, do you have exceedingly high standards? To illustrate this point, let's look at how perfectionism manifested in two iconic musical acts. So we've got the Beatles during their final years and 9 Inch Nails. All right, so let's have a look at these. So let's go with the former one and start with the Beatles. During the White Album and Let It Be sessions, John Lennon and Paul McCartney's perfectionism took dramatically different forms, but with equally destructive results. Recording engineer Jeff Emmerich described marathon sessions that devolved into endless nitpicking. McCartney demanded countless takes to achieve precise musical arrangements, while Lennon obsessed over capturing raw emotional authenticity. Their competing visions of perfect became weapons against each other. The studio became so toxic that they would rarely record together. Producer George Martin found himself increasingly sidelined as the band fractured under these perfectionistic demands. What's particularly fascinating is that this wasn't just about music. It was perfectionism externalized as interpersonal conflict. with both artists essentially saying, my version of perfect is the only acceptable one. Ouch. In stark contrast, Trent Reznor's perfectionism played out internally. As the creative force behind 9-Inch Nails, Reznor battled not only band members, but his own impossibly high standards. The 5-year gap between his breakthrough album, The Downward Spiral, and the follow-up, The Fragile, wasn't due to writer's block. It was perfectionism in action that caused the delay. Producer Alan Moulder recorded watching Reznor record the same guitar part hundreds of times, only to revert to an earlier take. While Lennon and McCartney's perfectionism led to the Beatles' breakup, Reznor's led to profound personal consequences, like depression, substance abuse, and creative paralysis. He later admitted that his inability to feel satisfied with his work contributed significantly to these struggles. What these examples show is that excessively high standards, whether projected outward, like the Beatles, or inward, like Reznor, ultimately impede creativity rather than enhance it. Some of their most celebrated work actually came from periods when perfectionism was temporarily held in check. The pursuit of flawlessness created diminished returns, with both acts reaching a point where perfectionism stopped serving their art and actually destroyed it. So I want you to ask yourself this question. Are your high standards enhancing your work, or are they becoming an obstacle to completion and satisfaction? Next question down is, do you have rules to help you achieve your high standards? Like, do you have really rigid rules, like completely unrealistic rigid rules? You know, rules like, I have to work 12 to 14-hour days in order to achieve them. And I have to work 7 days a week, 365 days of the year in order to achieve them. I would say that is unrealistic, rigid rule. Next question is, does all or nothing thinking mean that you feel you often don't meet your standards and that you perceive yourself as a failure as a result? So think of the example of Andy before, who was striving obsessively for promotion. Now, yes, he had received some promotion success. However, when he was unsuccessful in his application for promotion to professor and he was unsuccessful, he perceived that as a failure, like a mortal wound to himself, to the point where the bottom of his world just fell out underneath him and he couldn't continue on. This is part of the burnout picture here. Next question is, do you react to the perceived failure with self-criticism? Like I said before, Andy clearly was very self-critical of himself. And so this is part of the problem. The next one down is, think about how anxiety or low mood and stress contribute to the cycle of perfectionism. And so, of course, it feeds that perfectionism and just keeps it going. And the last question here is, if you do perceive that you sometimes meet your standards, like, how do you react? For instance, if you don't celebrate those successes, I would say that's a red flag. You need to stop, celebrate them. And if you're not, and you're moving on, and you're just putting them down to luck or good fortune, that's a red flag. In fact, I would encourage anyone who's listening to this, if you have any successes or success in anything you do, particularly if it's something you've strived very hard and long for, celebrate it. Take time. Take time out and celebrate it. Now, because perfectionistic beliefs and behaviours vary from person to person, it's important to identify problem areas. Now, I've already mentioned those questions. I'm not going to go through them again, but I think it's quite helpful to identify problem areas in your life. And you could do that through a diary. You can go back and listen to those questions again, and you can journal them. You can draw a diagram if you like. But I think it's important to work out where perfectionism is causing you problems in your life. And of course, a diary is just one way you can do that. There are other ways you can do it as well, and I'll just go through some of these other techniques with you for overcoming perfectionism. Another one is called what they call psychoeducation. That's just a form of education of challenging your cognitive schemas or the way you think. So being able to differentiate between fact from fiction. And so that's just, think of it like a bit of myth busting. So think of things like this. I'd want you to myth bust these type of things. So successful people work harder than less successful people. Well, that's just a flat out fallacy, isn't it? I would want part of that psychoeducation is about just challenging and being able to differentiate between fact from fiction. Another one is surveys. Well, generally, if you go see a psychologist, they'll want you to complete a whole range of surveys or questionnaires. That's just used to gather information about how people think and behave. Then there are a whole range of behavioural experiments. Well, behavioural experiments is just where you test some action or belief. Take, for instance, the well-known example, people can't be happy if they're not successful. Now, of course, this is just not true. But it's about challenging the notion of success. Like, what do we mean by success? Now, I know I've said it before in other episodes, for some people that's just making money, like a bucket load of money. For some people, it means something completely different. And so that's what that's all about. It's about challenging some of our belief systems. Next one is around looking at all or nothing thinking, about some of our inflexible and rigid ways, and just challenging that to understand that, yes, there is flexibility in our thinking and the way we do things. And of course, that can provide elements of freedom. So it's about just challenging the rigidity and flexibility of our rules and our standards. So I always say, yes, I love goals. I think goals are very important, but they have to be achievable. And if you can't achieve them within a realistic time frame, well, then you might need to reassess them. And again, at the end of the day, they have to be standards and they have to be achievable, and you have to generally set a timeline to them. So if it's a certain standard and you think it will take you 6 months, and if you don't reach that point in 6 months, well, clearly you need to reassess it because it's unachievable, it's unrealistic. Something might be going wrong. So this is about understanding that you can have flexibility about the way you think, flexibility around the way you can set standards and goals. I know I've already talked about it, but here, learning just to notice the positive. If you achieve something and you've been striving for 6 or more months to achieve it and you actually fully achieve it, stopping, celebrate. There's a well-known saying, stop to smell the roses. Well, yeah, stop, smell the roses, and then take pleasure in smelling the roses. The metaphor is apt here. Stop, celebrate it with loved ones, family, friends. Take some time out for yourself and really celebrate it. Take it in. Take it in like the smell of a beautiful flower. Just take that in. Take in the embodied aspect of that. Take pleasure in it. There is something very pleasurable about that. And I would encourage anyone, celebrate these positive aspects of your life. Do it, please. Do it for me, not for anyone else. Last one before we move on, and I talk to you a little bit about parenting and perfectionism, is this notion of self-criticism and compassion. Now, part of the perfectionistic trait or perfectionism is this self-criticism. And this is the challenging part. Somehow replacing that with kindness towards yourself, and at the same time acknowledging that everyone makes mistakes and has limitations. So we're just imperfect. And accepting the reality that as imperfect human beings, I'm going to make mistakes from time to time. Now, it's easy for me to sit here and say that, okay? Those of you who might have perfectionistic traits, I understand. I completely do. And it can be embarrassing. But the problem is that I always say to people, I made this embarrassing mistake. I thought everyone would notice it, and I'd be mortified and embarrassed. But the reality is most people don't. It's a bit like in this podcast. Yes, I'm fully aware when I make mistakes, and sometimes I'm embarrassed by it. However, I've come to accept that I'm going to make mistakes and that I'm an imperfect person. And what I think is embarrassing, and others will notice, the reality is not many people do. Other than Producer Luke. Producer Luke is all about quality and actually making sure that we can produce something of a high standard. So I'm in full agreement. If we make a silly mistake and we can correct it, well, we will. Now to parenting and perfectionism. All right, so as a father, I know how challenging it is to be a parent. Start again, sorry. Now to parenting and perfectionism. I felt like I had to say something here. So as a father, I know how challenging it is to be a parent. And so I was quite keen just to mention something about parenting and perfectionism in this episode. And I want to share with you a story from Mick the Magician. And Mick, who has a daughter, and his daughter clearly has really rigid and inflexible thinking. And initially Mick thought that he contributed to his daughter's perfectionism with his own high standards. In fact, Mick has very high standards himself, and he felt guilty that he was somehow passing on these high standards to his daughter. But he quickly realised that he needed to challenge his daughter's thinking in an appropriate and sensitive way, of course. And so what became clear is that his daughter hated change, and he discovered that she used to sit in her room for hours worrying about a whole range of different things. And obviously, as Mick and his wife became quite concerned about these, it became quite debilitating for his daughter, to the point that she had this fear of failure where she felt trapped and paralysed, couldn't do anything, nothing. So as you can imagine, like any parent who has a child in high school, there are all sorts of different assessments. And this did create problems. And initially it started with failure to submit assessment tasks. That's generally a red flag. All the way through to started to impact on her sleep. And of course, this started to build and build and build to the point where she wasn't eating and making herself physically ill. What I'm saying here is that these are just red flags. Straight up, they are red flags. And these are red flags that say to a parent, and if there are any parents listening to this episode, I would say to you, these are red flags where you need to find professional help. So if you have a child that is persistently anxious or avoidant of challenges, like, not meeting assessment deadlines or due dates at school, all the way through to physical symptoms like headaches or stomach aches or just feeling anxious to the point where they can't eat, all the way through to sleep problems or mood changes. These are red flags, and I would encourage you to seek out professional help who can assist you with this. Now, back to my story about Mick the Magician. He did share with me some things that he found quite helpful, and I just want to share some of them with you now. What he did do is he flipped the narrative. Instead of focusing on outcomes, as in, you have to win 9 out of 10 games of netball, for instance, he flipped the narrative to about the process. Okay, what are 1 or 2 things that you want to work on from last year that you want to improve on? And so it would then become a question of, okay, let's talk about something realistically, some of the things that we know you can achieve. And so this flipped the narrative from one of outcomes just to process. Another one was modelling what he said, this was Mick here, he said, where he modelled healthy responses to mistakes. So he confessed at appropriate times about his own mistakes and said, I made this mistake at work and this is what I did about it, and was being very open about the realities of his imperfection, how he makes mistakes and what he did about it, and was being very proactive about, this is the mistake I made. I didn't mean to make it. It was an honest mistake, but this is what I did about it. The other one was, he talked to me about, this is Mick the Magician, where he says, he created a space for imperfection. So he made sure that he did everything he possible to make his home a place where mistakes could be viewed as learning opportunities. And so rather than it being, you made a mistake, why didn't you do this? It was more a question of, okay, all right. What did you learn from what happened? And so that was that kind of progress mindset, if you like. What can we learn from this together? And he told me a little bit about, and I think he did this through the psychologist he was working with, but he talked about teaching positive self-talk. So replacing the I have to be perfect with, I'm just doing my best, and that's just going to have to be good enough. All the way through to, you know what, I can't be perfect. I'm actually imperfect, and sometimes I just have to accept that good enough is good enough. And so he was just talking about how that he was teaching this kind of positive self-talk. And the other one is he made a point of celebrating progress. And I really like this one, and I've incorporated it where possible in my own life. But it was about acknowledging improvements, not just achievements. So these can be sometimes small things. And it was about celebrating them, taking or pausing in your busy life and celebrating, acknowledging them, and so on. The other ones, and I'm nearly finished here, is around healthy risk-taking. And this was more about supporting his daughter to try new activities that he knew his daughter wouldn't immediately excel at. Now, these are very brave and courageous things to do. And I know it was very difficult for him. And I know it was very difficult for his daughter. And I know they have good and bad days. But it's about understanding that these are some of the things that parents can do. And the last one I just want to mention on before I talk about recapping some of the main points is that he distinguished between high standards and perfectionism. So, okay, we can have high standards that are motivating, and they need to be achievable and they need to be realistic, as you've already heard me talk about in detail. But this is where it becomes problematic. They can also be paralysing, or perfectionism can lead to a paralysing effect. And so we need to differentiate between, these are achievable goals versus unachievable goals of perfectionism. And so it's a bit about understanding how we set goals, time frames connected to them, understanding how we can work towards a goal, and so on and so forth. So let's recap the main points. And I just want to leave you a few takeaway points. I think it's important to realise that perfectionism stems from striving, that constant striving to achieve, but unrealistic standards. And these are self-imposed, that are just relentlessly pursued despite them causing problems. And of course, the other component, and I talked about this, is this connecting your self-worth or identity exclusively on how well you achieve these standards or pursue these standards. The other point I want to leave you with, or a takeaway point, is the difference between healthy pursuit of excellence and unhealthy perfectionism. And that generally unhelpful perfectionism is inflexible and rigid beliefs. And this is particularly when you connect your self-worth or identity in meeting these standards. So in a sense, this is actually unhelpful perfectionism, particularly if it leads to negative outcomes. So if you're just working 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're not getting any sleep, well, then I would say if it's having a negative impact on your life to the point where you can't function, that is a negative impact. If it's affecting how you eat, that is having a negative impact. If that's affecting your mood and it's making you anxious, these are all things that are having a negative impact on your life. Now, this is why we already know that perfectionism is associated with a range of problems. And this is why these are red flags. I just say to you, if you're listening to this and this is happening to you in your life, these are all red flags. And I would encourage you to just reevaluate what this means to you in your life. It didn't really make sense to me, perfectionism, until I used the cognitive behavioural model of perfectionism. That was developed by Safra and colleagues. It wasn't until I actually read that and I understood that model that I then get a general sense of how we can be trapped in this prison, that self-imposed prison of perfectionism. It is dangerous and really, really difficult to challenge and overcome. But with the right help and the right treatment through CBT or cognitive behavioural therapy with a trained professional psychologist trained in CBT, I know the evidence says that there can be a high degree of success. So if you're one of those individuals where perfectionism is negatively impacting your life, I would encourage you to seek professional help. Now, the last point I want to leave you with, the key really is identifying what's keeping your perfectionism going. Now, before I finish, a quick note to let you know that I'll be interviewing Professor Tracey Wade from Flinders University on this topic. So do make sure you tune in for this interview. I think I might leave it there. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. As we conclude our exploration of perfectionism, I'm reminded that many of us live caught between aspiration and acceptance, constantly navigating the tension between who we are and who we think we should be. Perhaps the most profound path forward isn't about eliminating our perfectionistic tendencies entirely, but rather developing a more compassionate relationship with them. What might change if we viewed our perfectionism not as a character flaw to overcome, but as a misguided attempt to protect ourselves from criticism, failure, or inadequacy? Now, I invite you to sit with this question in the coming days. what one small area of your life might benefit from loosening perfectionism's grip, where might good enough actually be enough. If this episode resonated with you, I'd appreciate you sharing it with someone who might benefit from this podcast. Until next time, this is Dr. Stephen Stolz, reminding you that sometimes our most profound growth happens not when we perfect ourselves, but when we embrace our beautiful imperfections. This has been Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. Until next time, stay curious and think deeply. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, stay curious and think deeply. A huge thank you to my amazing producer, Luke Watson, aka Producer Luke, a truckie from Petrie. Your endless support, creativity, and hard work make this podcast possible, and I'm so grateful to have you by my side on this journey. I couldn't do it without you, and so here's to many more episodes together. This has been a Flute Jazz production.